achieve any kind of deeper historical understanding of a text or a period or a past without acknowledging that you are operating on two planes simultaneously. I mean, even Simon Sharma does this in his book, That Certainties. I mean, and it's a problem that Henry James encounters in his book, where he says, I'd like to write history, but I want to occupy the past. In order to occupy the past, you have to do some kind of time travel. If I were able to do time travel and go back, I would capture it in all its fullness. But that's an illusion, because you would be exactly the same confused person in that period who couldn't understand what was going on. So, every 20 years, absolutely.
But I think in a sense that is the definition of a great historian or even a good historian as opposed to a competent historian. I think no good historian would try and read the past entirely in terms of the past or entirely in terms of the present. I mean, clearly you see the past through the prism of the present, but I think you also see the past in its own context, within its own rules. You don't try and impose the logic of the present on the past and say, why didn't X and Y do that? Because today we would have done that. But, that wasn't an option then. So, you see people within the context of their times. When it comes to translating texts, I think we're into a slightly different domain, because language changes and the meaning of language changes. So when you translate texts like the Ramayana or, the ancient Greek epics or whatever, or even Marcel Proust, the language you use, every 20 years people will come up with a new translation, and it will have its merits, and some people may prefer the old. But that is, I think, a normal process of mediating literature through language which changes.
I'm going to ask a slightly different question to Bapsi. When you are writing a character, when you are writing any character, and that character is living in a different time from the one you're writing in, so you're writing, say, today, about 40 years ago, how are you dealing with the language? And how are you dealing with the kind of choices your characters made? Because you are now 50 years ahead, a more modern being.
I've also taught a lot of creative writing classes, and I have not learned, I've never been to a creative writing class myself. As a child, I had polio, so I wasn't even sent to school. My parents were told, इसने थोड़ा doctor बनना है, professor बनना है, and ironically, I did become a professor. So, but luckily, I didn't ever have to do geometry or algebra or maths, and I escaped all of that stuff. But there is a certain amount of gift you have to be born with, and this is what I discovered when I was teaching, that if the person did not have the narrative gift, if they did not have the gift to tell a story, they could write beautiful sentences, but they couldn't come together as a plot, as a story, as somebody that held you. And I think you asked a question about characters.
Yes.
Well, characters, I find it very easy to write about people I know very well. With the result, my poor parents have been used in all my books several times, But again, I feel that if I write about people I know very well, like my relatives, they will eventually forgive me. If I write about my friends, then I disguise them thoroughly or try not to write about them. But, it is something which you don't plot and plan. One paragraph leads to the other, and that is where creative writing comes in.
So with your students, the students that you said you taught creative writing, you've taught creative writing as well,
Sorry,
right?
I again can't hear you.
He says you've taught creative writing,
and so with the students that you meet, how do you explain to them your writing process when they ask you?
Well, the only way I could teach them was, I can't lecture about writing, but I could edit their writing, line edit their writing, tell them, look, there has to be tension, there has to be dialogue. And these things only come through a lot of reading because, not going to school, my life was very lonely, so I filled it all up by reading a lot. And that writing is to do with words, So that's like the vitamins you're absorbing when you're reading. So the more you read, the more easy it becomes for one to write, I think. And, just now I met a student in Brandeis, it was, and he said, oh, don't assign us any books to read. I've read enough. And he was about 21. I said, you have to read a lot more than that, So the habit of reading seems to be disappearing now. And, the internet is changing the way writing will go, and it'll become definitely briefer. People have less tolerance for the beauty of language, which I still consider the beauty of language.
Right.
I wanted to
Go
take
ahead.
an example of, how one takes something from the past and understands it in the present. And the example is really all around us in Bombay. All around us, Bombay, you have these derelict mills, which look like ruins. I mean, including the Shakti mills, where the rape happened, and that comes to us as ruins, as derelicts, as places that have had their time. They're now as discards. Okay. Now, when you see it, and this is where I've been looking at the art done by artist over here, Meera Devi Dayal, on these spaces. What is interesting about those spaces is when you see them today, they don't have the kind of halo that they might have had in the 19th century. If you look at those structures, they were built with this kind of idea of permanence, of industrial modernity, that these factories would become, and they would remain forever, and they would become sort of engines of growth and prosperity and modernity and so on. Today, when you see them, they're ruins. And so you can now actually understand them without the kind of legitimating lens that they occupied in their own time. And now you can see that, okay, they appeared at a certain moment, they had a certain fantasy about themselves, and then they were destroyed, and something else takes its place.
So we have two options now. We have about half an hour left on this session. So either we can, because I see it's quite a large crowd, so either we can throw it we can throw it open for questions, or we can do another round. What does the panel feel?
I think we should bring the audience
in. All right, so we're going to take a round of questions, okay? So we're going to start with the lady in the front.
Hi, I am an author. I write for children, and I have a question for Babsi and the others. I'm looking at writing a historical fiction right now about a character who has fascinated me. I came across him in a book that I was reading, and I started researching on his life. Now, in his early years, as most famous people, there's very little known about him when he was younger, obviously, because he was not recorded. There's no records about his early life. In the later years of his life, everything's recorded. I'm trying to figure out how do I now, in the context of historical background, and based on the question that you were asking, how do I put myself in the mind of that person when he was younger, doing certain things which led to the events that happened in his later life? How do one get into the mindset of a person and imagine, and is that, if it's a historical fiction or historical story, is that valid?
Okay. So we'll take a few and then you can address them collectively.
Can I just make a plea? I think we're still getting a lot of echo. I'm finding it very difficult to follow what people.
Yeah.
Can I just ask your sound people to try an experiment? Can they try and turn down the volume slightly?
Can you turn down the volume?
Just generally, can you turn down the volume of the mics, of all the mics? Because I think we're getting howl around. Is that any better?
But
No.
they can't hear then.
Okay, can you turn it up a bit?
He's saying that basically this is creating a...
It's the acoustic. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Well,
Don't worry, I'm
What
following
was
up.
your question, that how do you inhabit the mind of a young girl
Yeah.
or of a man or a woman if you're a writer? Is that it?
My question is that I'm writing
We got it, yeah. Yeah.
a historical fiction, and I'm trying to see what his early years, what was he thinking of. So the question that you asked, how do you understand the mindset of a person based on about 100 years ago and write about him, which led to his life in his later years when he became famous?
Well, that is where the creativity comes in. Because as an author, you have to be, I mean, all of us have a bit of a man in us, a bit of a child in us, a bit of a woman in us, of all different ages. And also something called the inherited memories there. And when you try to write about a character, that does come out. Try and inhabit that person, because no matter if it was 100 years ago, the emotions are still the same. So what motivated that person would be the same even today. So you can put yourself and your own experiences into the person who you're writing about 100 years ago. Of course, you do a lot of historical study about that period so that you can add color there. But the emotional life is going to be the same then as it is now. At least I think so. Of course, very much so, very much.
I just want to make one comment on that, picking up on what Babsi said. Absolutely. I think it's a myth to think that a good historical novelist is just inventing, because there's a lot of hard slog and research. And, Hilary Mantel, who wins the Booker for her historical novels, spends 5 years on each novel researching in archives to get the detail right about what people might be saying to each other, what they might be thinking. It doesn't just come out of your imagination, unfortunately.
Anyone else? Okay, ma'am. At the back, yeah. The lady in the sunglasses on her head, yeah.
I want to sort of, I have resolved for myself this conflict, but I want to get some feedback from you. Today we always say live in the present. I mean, the philosophy of all modern philosophers says live in the present moment, not in the past, not in the future. Now, how do you resolve the title of your event with that thought, to live in the present, but yet you say that the past is always present?
Anyone want to take that? Gyan, why don't you go for this?
Because I live in the present. So then how do you resolve that what you're saying is also correct in a sense?
Well, if you're going to be a writer, you will live in the present, in the past, in the future. You will inhabit different rooms, different spheres, different times. If that's what you want to do. And of course, you can live in the present too. I'm not very sure of your question, but I'm sure I'll let other people answer that.
Right, so the lady with the mic and then the gentleman with the mic, yeah?
Well, I come from a family which has been affected by the partition. But when I grew up as a child and I talked about it with my grandparents who had to move in after 47 and my uncles, I don't really see much of they talking about the trauma which they really suffered. But my generation, which is post-partition, and my younger cousins, we do feel very strongly about the Pakistan-India relationship. Do you think as we are influenced more by what we read about fiction on partition rather than the real accounts which my uncles, my parents really suffered? I mean,
I guess, yeah, I think let's move to that gentleman. Hello? And then you can answer them together.
this is, my question is really, the discussion has been about a lot about revisionism and evidence and narrative, and a lot of it and research to do with the basis of fact, and giving facts their due and all that, and new discoveries and everything. But
clearer.
Sorry, and giving new discoveries, sort of that the need to revise and all that. But I've just come from a session, the Hindu mythology session, and I'm sure those of you who were there will be able to back me up on this. But there was a little mention of how I think it was Sudhir Kakar who said we shouldn't rely on facts too much. We should rely, we should keep to, with Hindu mythology and the truth that's there in mythology. And my question is really this, okay.
What is the question?
The question is, I think historians, and I just want, history is complacent to some degree in trying to establish that these are facts that should, kind of overturn fallacies about what people think. Because when he said that in the talk, people applauded him for this. So it's just the complacency to do with trying to assert that these are the facts, or this revisionism is part of one thing that is opposed to Hindu mythology and Christianity and all these.
Let's go. Does someone want to jump in on that? I mean, I think the question was about the tension between the primacy of fact and the kind of resonances of fiction or feeling, I think, where apparently he's referencing a prior session where someone said that we should not rely too much on fact. But I think given that we've got a bunch of historians here, I think they're pretty invested in facts. So let's take that as a given, or?
Well, I just want to say something that one person's fact can be someone else's fiction and vice versa. I mean, I don't believe in the sanctity of facts. Facts change. Historians select facts. They don't present you with all the facts they ever found in any archive. There is constant selection going on. So, in a sense, novelists, I think, are doing the same thing. They are presenting reality as they see it. So I think we should always be slightly suspicious of historians who say this is entirely factual. Nothing is entirely factual.
Right, the lady in the red.
And there's always a lot of bias in what is said, There's so many truths. There's not one single truth. There are many truths.
My question is, what is more harmful, inaccurate history or passionate fiction?
Okay, I think we should get all of them to answer this.